Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back to ancient Egypt, a time when the air was thick with the sweet, intoxicating scent of flowers. Flowers that weren't just for decoration, but were woven into the very fabric of spiritual and everyday life. Imagine stepping into a temple, the walls covered in hieroglyphs, and the soft, earthy aroma of sacred blossoms filling your senses. You probably won't survive this if you don't have a love for ancient beauty rituals. So prepare to be swept away in the story of how ancient Egyptians made perfume from these sacred flowers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious to know where my viewers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of perfume in ancient Egypt begins with a connection to the divine. It wasn't just about smelling nice. It was about communicating with the gods. Flowers were regarded as sacred in ancient Egyptian culture, and their fragrances were considered a direct link to the heavens. It wasn't just any flower that made it into the perfume pot, mind you. No, these flowers had to be special. Think of the lotus, with its delicate white petals unfolding to reveal a sweet scent that was said to carry the essence of life itself. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians believed that the lotus held mystical powers, or if it was simply their natural connection to nature that gave it such reverence. Either way, it was a flower of great importance. Sacred flowers weren't just plucked at random either. In ancient Egypt, they were carefully chosen based on their symbolic meanings and associations with specific gods and goddesses. For example, the blue water lily, with its strong connection to the sun god Ra, was seen as an emblem of rebirth and immortality. This flower was revered not only for its beauty, but for its sacredness. Imagine how the Egyptians must have felt as they gathered these flowers, fully aware of their power to invoke the gods. The flower wasn't just a visual symbol. It was a key to the spiritual world. Historians still debate how far-reaching the use of sacred flowers was, whether it was reserved solely for the temples and royalty, or if ordinary people, too, could access their fragrances. One thing's for sure, the flowers were a big deal. It's said that the scent of the flowers had the power to change the atmosphere, making a person feel more connected to the divine or more elevated spiritually. Now that's some power packed into a blossom, right? The Egyptians were incredibly particular about these flowers. They didn't just grab a few petals off the nearest bloom. They approached the flowers with respect, much like an offering to the gods. These flowers were often grown in specific gardens, tended with care, and were part of intricate religious ceremonies. The fragrance was, in a way, their gateway to the gods' favor. But here's the kicker. Egyptians didn't just keep these flowers to themselves. No, they made sure to share the sacred scent with others. This didn't just happen in the temples either. The perfume rituals extended to everyday life. The wealthy would have their homes infused with the scent of sacred flowers, while nobles and royalty would bathe in scented waters made from these blossoms. Imagine walking into a royal palace where every breath is filled with the divine aroma of flowers that were believed to connect you to the gods themselves. It was an immersive experience in every way. As you settle in and listen to this journey through history, think about the richness of the scent that surrounded the ancient Egyptians, how every smell was carefully chosen, how each flower was treated like gold. And as we continue, remember that these flowers weren't just something nice to smell. They were a symbol of life, the divine, and the eternal. Now that you've got a sense of the sacredness of flowers in ancient Egypt, let's dig into how these blossoms were used in the process of perfume making. We're not talking about your typical store-bought perfumes here, my friend. No, these ancient concoctions were crafted with the utmost care and reverence, and the rituals surrounding them were just as important as the flowers themselves. Imagine, for a moment, that you're in the bustling marketplace of an ancient Egyptian city. Around you, vendors are selling all sorts of goods, from fine linens to exotic spices. But it's the fragrance in the air that draws you in. You take a deep breath, and before you know it, you've caught a whiff of a heavenly blend, perhaps a combination of jasmine, lotus, or cinnamon. Each flower meticulously chosen for its unique properties. Historians still debate the exact flowers used in ancient Egyptian perfumes, but it's clear that these blooms weren't just picked on a whim. They were carefully selected for their symbolism, fragrance, and medicinal value. In temples and homes, the flower harvest would begin with the rise of the sun, as these blossoms were believed to hold the power of the gods, especially the sun god Ra. A common practice was to gather the flowers at dawn, the earliest hours when the blooms were still fresh, their fragrance pure and powerful. They'd be carefully laid out on altars or trays, offering up their essence before they were turned into the fragrant oils that would be used in various rituals. You can almost picture the temple priests moving with grace and ceremony as they collected these sacred flowers, mindful of their task. The flowers weren't just picked and tossed into a jar. There was an art to the preparation. It began with grinding and pressing the flowers, extracting their natural oils with painstaking care. But that wasn't the end of it. Once the oils were collected, they were often mixed with other ingredients, resins, herbs, and spices, to create a richer, more complex scent. The perfumers sometimes priests themselves, were highly skilled, and the art of perfume making was considered a sacred craft passed down through generations. In fact, some records suggest that perfumers were seen as almost mystical figures, their work a bridge between the earthly realm and the divine. But it wasn't just about crafting perfumes for the temples or for the royalty. The ancient Egyptians believed that these oils could be used to protect the wearer from illness or misfortune. They would wear these oils as a form of personal armor to fend off evil spirits and to maintain their health. You'd find people wearing small vials of perfume as amulets, carrying the fragrance with them wherever they went, believing that the scent could ward off bad luck or disease. Of course, this wasn't just a random superstition. There were actual medicinal uses for the flowers in these perfumes, some of which were believed to have healing properties. Historians still argue about the precise methods of distillation and extraction the Egyptians used. While they certainly had some form of rudimentary distillation techniques, it wasn't quite the sophisticated process we know today. Instead, the Egyptians utilized a technique called enfleurage, a method of infusing fat with flowers to extract their fragrance. The oils were then mixed with various other ingredients, including honey, milk, and sometimes even wine, to create what we now recognize as perfumes. Of course, the perfumes made in ancient Egypt were far more than just luxuries. They were a way of expressing status. A high-ranking official or royal would wear perfumes that were much stronger, richer, and more complex, with fragrances lasting longer. These perfumes were reserved for special occasions, rituals, and ceremonies, making them a sign of power and prestige. Meanwhile, the everyday Egyptian would wear lighter, less potent scents, but even these would be used with great care. Perfume was not a casual accessory. It was a key part of one's identity. You see, these sacred flower perfumes weren't just about smell. They were deeply intertwined with Egyptian identity, health, spirituality, and status. They represented a connection between the living and the divine, offering protection and blessing. Now imagine walking into an ancient Egyptian home, where even the air you breathe is laced with divine fragrance. The presence of these flowers wasn't just a luxury. It was a reflection of the culture's profound connection to the gods, to nature, and to the very essence of life itself. The flowers weren't just ingredients in a perfume. They were vital to the spiritual and physical well-being of the people, carried through every ritual, prayer, and personal moment. So as you let the image of those sacred flowers and their divine perfumes settle into your mind, remember, these weren't just pretty scents designed to make life a little sweeter. They were living symbols of a deeper connection to the divine, used in rituals to honor the gods, heal the sick, and even protect from the forces of evil. As we continue our journey, let's take a moment to reflect on the role of the gods in the perfume making process. You might think that perfume making is all about blending beautiful flowers to create pleasing scents. But in ancient Egypt, this act was far more sacred. The Egyptians didn't just make perfumes for themselves, they made them to honor their gods. And in doing so, they believed the fragrance would carry their prayers and offerings straight to the heavens. In ancient Egyptian religion, gods and goddesses were not just mythical beings to be worshipped. They were deeply integrated into every part of life, and this included the world of fragrance. The Egyptians believed that scents, particularly those created from sacred flowers, had the power to invoke divine favor and bless those who wore them. In fact, certain flowers were considered sacred and directly associated with specific deities, imbuing the perfumes created from them with the divine essence of that god or goddess. Take the blue lotus, for example. This flower was so deeply intertwined with Egyptian spirituality that it was linked to both the sun god Ra and the goddess Isis, who was revered for her powers of healing and protection. Historians still argue whether the blue lotus was symbolic of the sun's power, or whether its intoxicating fragrance actually had psychoactive properties that could bring the wearer closer to divine realms. Some even suggest that it was used in rituals to induce a trance-like state, which could explain its spiritual significance. If you wore perfume made from the blue lotus, you were literally basking in the fragrance of a goddess. Then there's the papyrus plant, which the ancient Egyptians associated with the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. Hathor was often depicted as a woman with cow horns, symbolizing fertility and motherhood, and she was believed to be the protector of women and children. Perfumes made from papyrus would often be worn by priests and priestesses to invoke her blessings of love, fertility, and happiness. Imagine, just for a moment, that you're attending a ritual in an ancient Egyptian temple, the air filled with the delicate scent of papyrus. The fragrance wasn't just a sweet smell, it was a call to the goddess herself. But the most powerful connection between flowers and gods came through the act of offering. When perfume was created in Egypt, it wasn't just a personal indulgence. It was part of a larger ritualistic offering to the gods. Flowers were harvested with great care and presented as tributes in temples, where they were often burned or their essence extracted for the gods. Some believe that the act of burning these sacred flowers symbolized the transition of offerings from the physical world to the spiritual one. The smoke rising toward the heavens was seen as the prayers and desires of the people, carried by the fragrance. As you sit back and picture this, imagine the intense spirituality behind every drop of perfume. The ancient Egyptians didn't just want to smell nice. They wanted their scents to be their messages to the gods. They wanted their fragrances to carry their love, their hopes, and their prayers straight to the divine. The perfume wasn't just a physical object, it was an offering, a form of communication with the gods, and a ritual act of devotion. Historians still argue how the Egyptians understood the spiritual power of fragrance. While many believe they saw it as a way to directly communicate with deities, others suggest that they may have believed the fragrance could serve as a shield or a tool for magic. Regardless of the exact belief, one thing is certain: these sacred perfumes were not just cosmetics, they were a form of divine interaction. Imagine, if you will, a grand temple with the air thick with the scent of sacred flowers: lotus, papyrus, frankincense, each one representing not just beauty, but a deep connection with the gods. As the incense burned and the perfumes filled the air, you could almost feel the presence of the divine, as though you were standing in the very space where the gods themselves could descend. Perfume was, in essence, a bridge between the mortal and divine worlds, a means for humans to present themselves as worthy of divine favor. The Egyptians understood fragrance not just as a luxury, but as a language, a sacred one that carried their hopes, fears, and prayers to the gods above. Now take a deep breath and let that idea settle into your mind. It's not just about the flowers or the perfume or the ritual. It's about the intimate relationship between the earthly and the divine. The Egyptians believed that through scent, they could transcend the physical world and enter into the divine presence. And that, my friend, is an incredibly powerful concept. Now that we've explored how the gods played a crucial role in perfume making, let's take a step back and dive in to the fascinating process of distillation. You might be wondering, how did ancient Egyptians actually extract the precious oils from these sacred flowers? After all, they didn't have the fancy, modern-day distillation equipment we use now. But that didn't mean their methods were any less effective. In fact, they were ingenious in their own way, and their techniques laid the groundwork for the perfume-making processes we use today. Ancient Egyptian perfumers used a combination of processes to extract the oils from flowers, with one of the most important being enfleurage. This was the method of infusing oils or fats with flower petals, essentially allowing the flowers to slowly release their natural fragrances over time. The petals would be placed in a thin layer of fat, and the oils from the flowers would gradually mix with the fat, creating a fragrant substance. Once the fat had absorbed enough of the scent, it would be heated to separate the fragrance from the fat, resulting in an aromatic oil that could be used for perfume or other purposes. It wasn't a quick process by any means. In fact, enfleurage could take days or even weeks, depending on the flower and the desired strength of the fragrance. While we might consider that time-consuming, it was a labor of love and devotion for the ancient Egyptians. To them, perfume wasn't something that could be rushed. It was a sacred process that required patience, care, and attention to detail. Perfume wasn't just made for the sake of vanity. It was made for the gods. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians fully understood the chemistry behind the process, but it's clear that they had mastered it. Ancient texts, including some found in the tombs of pharaohs, mention that the process of perfume making was a closely guarded secret, passed down only to those with the necessary skill and spiritual insight. This suggests that distillation wasn't just a technical skill, it was also a mystical one. But enfleurage wasn't the only technique used by the Egyptians. They also employed other methods, like boiling or soaking flowers in water to extract their oils. The resulting fragrant waters were then mixed with other substances like resins, spices, and even wine to create more complex perfumes. The water, now infused with the essence of the flowers, would carry the fragrance in a lighter, more delicate form, which was ideal for everyday wear. Think about it. On a hot Egyptian day, you could walk through the bustling streets, your body lightly scented with the refreshing aroma of jasmine or lotus. The fragrance was as much a part of you as your clothing. Historians argue about the actual chemical processes used by the Egyptians, but it's clear that they understood the power of scent in a way that went beyond just enjoyment. It was a sacred ritual, a blending of nature, spirit, and science. As you reflect on this, remember that the Egyptians weren't simply blending flowers to create perfumes. They were essentially distilling a piece of nature's essence. The flower's oils weren't just extracted for personal luxury. They were distilled for their spiritual power, their ability to connect people with the gods. In the process, they were transforming the natural world into something divine. While modern perfume making uses complex distillation methods and synthetic chemicals, the ancient Egyptians relied on their deep understanding of the natural world. They knew that the best perfumes weren't just about mixing scents. They were about capturing the essence of life itself. And in doing so, they created fragrances that would transcend time, becoming an integral part of their culture and rituals. In the absence of modern machinery, the ancient Egyptians were able to produce perfumes that were not only incredibly potent, but also beautifully complex. The combination of their patience, skill, and connection to the divine resulted in fragrances that were incredibly rich and lasting. They weren't just making something to wear. They were crafting an experience, one that carried with it the weight of thousands of years of tradition and spirituality. Now, take a moment to imagine yourself in the ancient world, breathing in the air filled with the rich, deep aromas of these sacred flowers. It's not just a scent you're experiencing, it's a window into a time and culture that valued beauty, spirituality, and the divine in every aspect of life. Now that we've uncovered the mystical process of distillation, let's shift our focus to the most coveted use of perfume in ancient Egypt, its role in the life of the pharaohs. Perfume wasn't just a luxury item, it was an essential part of the royal lifestyle, woven deeply into their daily routines, rituals, and even their interactions with the gods. Imagine walking into the court of a pharaoh, the air thick with the scent of rich, divine fragrances. This wasn't just about vanity. Perfume was a symbol of power, status, and divine favor. The pharaohs were the ultimate patrons of perfume, often using it to mark their royal status. In ancient Egypt, scent was tied to more than just personal hygiene or allure. It was seen as a sacred tool, a way to project divine favor and to communicate with the gods. The pharaohs didn't just use perfume as a luxury, they saw it as a form of spiritual armor. By wearing perfumes made from sacred flowers, they believed they could connect directly with the gods and receive their protection and blessing. It was as though the fragrance itself acted as a divine shield, ensuring the pharaoh's strength and favor. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian royal perfume use was how it was tied to rituals. Every day, the pharaoh would partake in an elaborate ceremony where he would cleanse his body and anoint himself with fragrant oils. This wasn't a quick dab of perfume, as we might imagine today. No, this was a full, ritualistic process. The oils were applied with great care, often starting with a light wash and followed by anointing the body with oils infused with lotus, jasmine, and frankincense. The act of anointing wasn't just for personal fragrance, it was about becoming one with the divine. It was a symbolic act of renewal, preparing the pharaoh for his duties as the earthly representative of the gods. Historians still argue about how elaborate these rituals really were. Some suggest that the rituals were even more intricate than we know, involving specialized priests dedicated solely to preparing the pharaoh's perfumes and oils. These perfumers would have been highly skilled individuals, possibly with training in both the physical and spiritual aspects of perfume making. They weren't just making something that smelled nice. They were crafting a powerful, sacred tool for the ruler. But let's not forget that perfume also served another important role in the royal court as a diplomatic gift. In ancient Egypt, perfume wasn't just a private indulgence. It was a lavish offering that helped cement alliances and friendships with foreign leaders. Imagine receiving a gift of exquisite perfume made from sacred flowers that carried the divine essence of Egypt's gods. The gesture would have been seen as an offering of goodwill and divine favor. It wasn't just about the scent, it was a political act steeped in symbolism. Of course, perfumes weren't just worn during formal ceremonies. The pharaohs would have had their personal perfumes, which they wore regularly to mark their status as divine rulers. The power of these perfumes wasn't just in the fragrance, it was in the association with the gods themselves. Wearing perfume was a way of displaying one's divine connection, proof that the gods were with the wearer, granting favor and protection. Every breath of fragrance taken by the pharaoh was a reminder that they were not simply mortal rulers, but intermediaries between the gods and the people. Now, imagine the grand banquets and ceremonies where the pharaoh would be surrounded by his courtiers, each one smelling like the divine, each one projecting their status through their choice of perfume. These weren't just pleasant-smelling gatherings. They were spiritual events where every scent was a whisper of the divine. The pharaoh would enter these ceremonies, the air around him fragrant with the aromas of sacred flowers, and he would be the center of attention, revered not just as a leader, but as a godly figure. Perfume was, in essence, a symbol of divine authority and protection, and it permeated every aspect of royal life. The act of wearing it, preparing it, and offering it wasn't just about indulgence, it was about maintaining the connection between the earthly and the divine. The pharaohs weren't just anointed with perfume for personal pleasure. They were anointed with the very essence of the gods. The royal use of perfume was so central to Egyptian society that it's impossible to imagine the life of a pharaoh without it. It was an essential part of their identity, as much a symbol of their divine rule as their crown and scepter. So, next time you see a picture of a pharaoh wearing gold and jewels, remember that the scent that surrounded them was just as much a part of their royal presence as their physical adornments. As we continue, let's take a step deeper into the sacred oils and their uses in ancient Egyptian culture. While perfume is often the first thing that comes to mind when we think of scent, the Egyptians were far from shallow in their approach to fragrance. For them, the oils and perfumes made from sacred flowers were much more than just pleasant aromas. These oils were used in a variety of spiritual, medicinal, and practical ways, making them an integral part of daily life in ancient Egypt. Whether for personal use, ritualistic purposes, or healing, these oils played a significant role in connecting the physical world to the divine. Imagine this. You've just returned from a long day in the desert heat, your skin parched and cracked by the unforgiving sun. But as you enter your home, you're greeted by the soothing scent of frankincense, burning softly in the background. The fragrance is calming, cooling, almost medicinal, and the moment it touches your skin, you feel a sense of peace wash over you. This wasn't just an act of self-care. It was a spiritual and physical ritual that ancient Egyptians believed could restore balance and health. While we often associate perfume with vanity, the Egyptians used scented oils in far more practical ways. For one, these oils were used as skincare products. With the harsh desert sun beating down, the Egyptians needed something to protect their skin from the elements. Frankincense and myrrh were often used for this purpose, both for their aromatic properties and their ability to soothe and heal skin. Myrrh, in particular, was highly prized for its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial qualities, making it a key ingredient in Egyptian skincare regimens. Beyond skincare, scented oils also served a medical purpose. Egyptian physicians, who were incredibly skilled in herbal medicine, used aromatic oils as part of their treatments. These oils were believed to have healing properties, able to treat everything from digestive issues to wounds. For example, the oil of the lotus flower was often used to ease aches and pains, while other oils were used to treat common ailments like colds or headaches. The use of these oils wasn't just practical, it was also a form of spiritual healing. The Egyptians believed that the power of the scent itself could influence the body and mind, bringing balance and harmony. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians truly understood the full medicinal power of these oils, or whether their use was more symbolic. Some believe that the oil's healing properties were primarily a result of their association with the gods, while others think that the Egyptians had a more practical understanding of their medicinal benefits. Either way, the oils were considered a form of divine intervention, able to both soothe the body and protect the soul. Scented oils were also an important part of religious rituals, where they were used to anoint the statues of gods, as well as priests and priestesses. This act wasn't just about cleanliness or fragrance. It was a way of preparing the body and spirit to connect with the divine. The oils would be carefully applied with great reverence before performing sacred duties. For example, during the daily temple rituals, priests would cleanse themselves with water infused with oils, ensuring that they were pure before approaching the gods. The act of anointing oneself was seen as an essential step in creating a sacred space between the individual and the divine. But oils weren't just used in religious settings. They were part of every aspect of Egyptian life, from childbirth to death. During the embalming process, myrrh, frankincense, and other oils were used to preserve the body and to help guide the soul to the afterlife. The fragrance of these oils was believed to carry the spirit of the deceased to the gods, ensuring that they would be welcomed into the divine realm. The Egyptians took great care in choosing the right oils for embalming, as the scents were thought to help the spirit navigate the afterlife and communicate with the gods. So, when we think of these sacred oils, it's important to remember that they weren't just luxuries. They were tools for spiritual protection, health, and connection with the divine. The Egyptians didn't just use fragrance to smell good. They used it to connect with the gods, heal their bodies, and preserve their spirits. It was a deeply ingrained part of their spiritual and practical lives, as integral to their daily routines as food and water. Now, picture the scene once again. You're an ancient Egyptian, the soft scent of frankincense filling the air as you go about your daily rituals. Whether it's to soothe your skin, ease a headache, or connect with the divine, the oils surrounding you aren't just for pleasure. They're for survival, for protection, and for spiritual well-being. They're more than just perfumes. They're sacred tools that help you navigate the physical and spiritual worlds. Let's now take a closer look at the process of perfume creation itself. It's one thing to have access to sacred flowers, and it's another thing entirely to transform them into the potent, divine fragrances that ancient Egyptians so highly valued. While the exact recipes may have been kept secret, we do know that the process was both an art and a science, requiring skill, patience, and a deep understanding of both nature and the spiritual world. The process of creating perfume in ancient Egypt was meticulous. It all started with the collection of flowers, which, as we've already seen, was a sacred act in itself. The flowers had to be picked at the peak of their bloom, ensuring that the fragrance was as potent as possible. A single flower could provide only a small amount of fragrance, so the process often involved gathering large quantities to extract enough essential oils to make a meaningful amount of perfume. Historians still debate whether the flowers were harvested by priests in the early morning hours, or whether farmers and workers were also involved in this sacred task. But one thing is certain: the flowers were handled with care, as though they were offerings to the gods themselves. Once gathered, the flowers would be carefully prepared for the extraction process. The petals were often ground up to release their oils, but this was just the beginning. The method of extractions was critical to ensuring that the oils captured the purest essence of the flowers. The most common method used by the Egyptians was enfleurage, which, as we discussed earlier, involved pressing flowers into fat or oil. The fat would absorb the fragrance of the flowers, and once it was saturated, the fat would be gently heated to release the oil, which could then be used in perfume or for medicinal purposes. This technique may sound simple, but it required a delicate touch. The perfumer had to know exactly when the fat was saturated enough to release the oils, and they had to be careful not to damage the delicate scents. Too much heat, and the oils would lose their potency, too little, and the fragrance wouldn't be strong enough. It was a fine balance, and the Egyptians were masters at it. Once the essential oils were extracted, they would be mixed with other ingredients to create the final perfume. These ingredients weren't just chosen for their scent, they were also selected for their symbolic meaning. Resins like myrrh and frankincense were often added, both for their religious significance and their ability to enhance the perfume's fragrance. These resins, particularly frankincense, were associated with the gods, making them the perfect additions to a perfume meant to honor the divine. The oils would then be mixed with a base, often made from olive oil or other natural oils, which helped to carry the fragrance and ensure that it lasted longer on the skin. The final step in creating the perfume was to allow it to mature. Just like a fine wine, the fragrance needed time to settle and blend together. The Egyptians would often store their perfumes in ceramic jars or glass vials, where they could age and reach their full potential. The longer the perfume aged, the more complex its fragrance would become, as the various oils and resins would blend together into a harmonious whole. Some of the most precious perfumes were aged for months, if not years, before they were used or presented as gifts. But perfume wasn't just about luxury. The creation process was a deeply spiritual act, one that connected the perfumer with the divine. In some cases, the perfume was considered an offering to the gods, and the act of creating it was seen as a form of worship. It wasn't just about creating something that smelled good. It was about crafting a fragrance that could carry prayers, requests, and messages to the gods. The ancient Egyptians believed that the perfume they made held spiritual power, and that by wearing it, they could invite the gods into their lives. As you think about this process, consider how much effort and thought went into each bottle of perfume. It wasn't something that could be rushed. The flowers had to be picked with care, the oils extracted with precision, and the final product allowed to mature over time. This was a process steeped in patience, dedication, and reverence, a far cry from the mass-produced perfumes we buy today. So, next time you pick up a bottle of perfume, think about the centuries of tradition and craftsmanship that went into the process. The ancient Egyptians didn't just create perfume for vanity. They created it as an offering to the gods, as a way of connecting with the divine, and as a form of spiritual and physical care. The perfumes they created weren't just products, they were sacred tools, imbued with meaning and purpose. And in a way, they've passed down this tradition to us, even though we may not always recognize the depth of their history. As we move forward in this journey, let's take a look at the significant role that perfume played as a symbol of social status in ancient Egypt. For the Egyptians, scent wasn't just about personal preference or spiritual connection. It was a clear marker of wealth, power and prestige. To wear the right fragrance wasn't just about smelling good. It was about showing the world your place within the rigid social hierarchy of ancient Egyptian society. The pharaohs, of course, were at the top of this hierarchy, and they used perfume as an essential part of their regal identity. The scents they wore were often made from the finest and rarest ingredients: frankincense, myrrh, and lotus flowers, often reserved for the elite. Wearing these luxurious perfumes marked them not only as leaders, but as divine representatives on earth. Their perfumes were richer and more complex than anything the average person could afford, and the fragrance was as much a symbol of their divine rule as their elaborate headdresses and golden jewelry. But while perfume was often reserved for the elite, it wasn't just pharaohs who used it to communicate status. Even commoners in ancient Egypt understood the power of scent. The rich aromas of perfume were a visible marker of one's wealth and social standing, and the act of wearing perfume was woven into every aspect of life. Wealthy individuals and nobles would have access to the most potent, elaborate perfumes, while lower-ranking Egyptians might wear simpler, more affordable fragrances made from flowers like jasmine or lavender. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling streets of an ancient Egyptian city. You'd see crowds of people, some of them wearing the rich, intoxicating scents of rare flowers, others wearing lighter, simpler fragrances. These perfumes weren't just for special occasions. They were an everyday part of life, used during work, at social gatherings, and even while walking through the markets. The fragrances carried by individuals spoke volumes about their status, and in a society as visually and symbolically rich as Egypt's, scent became a language of its own. Historians still debate the extent to which perfume was a status symbol in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that scent was so important that it was used not just to signify wealth, but to create an aura of influence and authority. For example, during royal ceremonies, perfume was used as part of the ritual to establish the legitimacy and divine right of the ruling pharaoh. The fragrance, rich and complex, signified that the ruler was not just a political figure, but someone who had been chosen by the gods to lead. Beyond its use in ceremonies and royal rituals, perfume also served as a form of diplomacy. Gifts of perfume were a common way to establish alliances and show respect in ancient Egyptian society. Foreign dignitaries, after being received by the pharaoh, would often be presented with vials of perfume as a sign of goodwill. The fragrance wasn't just a gift, it was a way to communicate favor, respect, and the promise of future collaboration. The perfume wasn't just a gesture of politeness. It carried with it the weight of divine favor and royal blessing. Interestingly, it wasn't just the wealthy who could partake in the luxury of scent. Even the middle and lower classes had access to simpler forms of perfume, often created using more common flowers and herbs that were locally available. These perfumes, while less complex than those used by the pharaohs, still carried significant social meaning. The act of wearing perfume, even a modest one, showed that the wearer cared about their appearance and was conscious of the role scent played in their social identity. Even for those who couldn't afford the finest fragrances, perfume remained an important part of daily life. What's fascinating is that the ancient Egyptians were aware of the social power of scent, and they harnessed it deliberately. It wasn't just about personal enjoyment, it was about showing the world your place in society. The rich wore perfumes that signified their high status, while the middle class wore simpler but still meaningful fragrances. For all of them, scent was a way of communicating without words, a language of status, power, and self-expression. As you reflect on this, think about how fragrance works in our modern world. While we might not wear perfume for spiritual reasons or as a direct offering to the gods, we still use scent to communicate who we are, whether it's the luxurious scent of a high-end perfume or a more subtle, everyday fragrance. The connection between scent and social status has persisted for thousands of years, and it's fascinating to see how the ancient Egyptians, with their deep understanding of the power of perfume, laid the groundwork for this practice. So, next time you spray on your favorite fragrance, remember that perfume has always been more than just a personal indulgence. It's been a tool for self-expression, a symbol of status, and a way to connect with the divine. As we approach the later chapters of our journey, it's time to explore the fascinating evolution of Egyptian perfume making and its influence on the centuries that followed. The ancient Egyptians were not just masters in the art of creating fragrance, they were trailblazers. Their perfume-making techniques and sacred flower recipes would go on to influence other ancient civilizations, from the Greeks to the Romans, and even extend into the world of modern perfumery. It's incredible to think that the perfumes we wear today, whether it's a floral, woody, or citrus-based scent, owe much of their origins to the practices established by the Egyptians over 4,000 years ago. Their methods of extracting essential oils, creating blends, and using scent in religious rituals laid the groundwork for future generations. In fact, many of the techniques used in ancient Egypt were still used in Europe and the Middle East centuries later, albeit with improvements and refinements. For instance, the ancient Greeks, who admired Egyptian culture, adopted many of their perfume-making practices. The Greeks believed in the power of scent, not only for personal pleasure, but as a way to invoke the gods. They began to use perfumes in their religious ceremonies, just like the Egyptians. In fact, some of the earliest references to perfume in Greek texts cite Egyptian methods of extracting fragrance from flowers. The Greeks, like the Egyptians, associated fragrance with divine power and frequently anointed statues of gods with fragrant oils. The Romans, too, were deeply influenced by the Egyptians. Roman emperors and nobility used perfumes extensively as both a personal luxury and a status symbol. Some Roman historians even mention the Egyptian origins of perfume and the ways in which the Egyptians' expertise was passed down to the Romans. Roman perfumers were trained in Egyptian techniques, and many of the ingredients used in Roman perfumes, like myrrh and frankincense, were also favored in ancient Egypt. Perfume, much like in Egypt, became a symbol of wealth, power, and spiritual connection in Roman society. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' perfume-making techniques were fully appreciated by other civilizations in their time. While we know the Egyptians valued their fragrant creations deeply, it's unclear if their perfume methods were as widely disseminated in their own era as they were in the centuries that followed. However, the enduring legacy of Egyptian perfume making is undeniable. The techniques, the reverence for sacred flowers, and the spiritual significance of scent all traveled across borders, influencing cultures far beyond the banks of the Nile. By the time we reach the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, perfume had become firmly entrenched in European culture, with many of the early recipes drawing on Egyptian traditions. While perfume making in Europe advanced with new distillation techniques and an expanded palette of ingredients, the fundamental understanding of fragrance as a divine and cultural symbol remained rooted in ancient Egyptian practice. Even today, some of the most popular perfumes contain ingredients that the Egyptians would recognize: roses, jasmine, sandalwood, and vanilla. The connection between modern perfumery and ancient Egyptian practices is more than a coincidence. It's the continuation of a timeless tradition. The Egyptian influence on modern perfume making is also evident in the way perfume is marketed today. Fragrance companies, especially those that produce luxury perfumes, often emphasize the historical and cultural significance of scent, much as the ancient Egyptians did. The idea that fragrance can connect us to something divine, something transcendent, is a theme that persists in the advertising and branding of high-end perfumes. Even the lavish packaging of modern perfumes, with their ornate bottles and gold accents, echoes the luxurious, ritualistic packaging of Egyptian perfume vials. But despite all the advances in perfume making since the time of the Egyptians, there's something irreplaceable about the spiritual connection the ancient Egyptians had with fragrance. For them, perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a sacred act, a way to connect with the gods and with the essence of life itself. No matter how much we may refine or alter the process, modern perfumery can never quite replicate the sense of reverence and devotion that permeated Egyptian perfume making. So, as you spritz your favorite fragrance on this evening, think about the ancient Egyptians, their meticulous craftsmanship, their sacred rituals, and their belief in the power of fragrance as a link to the divine have left a lasting legacy that continues to shape the world of perfume today. The scents we wear, the rituals we have, and the way fragrance connects us to our memories and our identities. These are all part of the deep, ancient roots that were planted in the sands of Egypt. As we near the final chapter of our exploration into the ancient Egyptian art of perfume making, let's take a moment to reflect on the lasting legacy of Egyptian fragrance on modern perfumery. Even though the ancient world has long since passed, the cultural influence of Egyptian perfume making is still alive today, woven into every bottle of perfume you own and in every fragrance that fills the air. Perfume, as we know it, would not be the same without the contributions of the ancient Egyptians. While other civilizations, such as the Greeks and Romans, certainly made their own mark on the evolution of fragrance, the foundation was laid by the Egyptians. They were the pioneers, the first to develop techniques for extracting essential oils from flowers and resins, the first to turn scent into a sacred art form that transcended the boundaries of luxury and became a tool for connecting with the divine. When you think about the perfumes we wear today, it's easy to overlook their ancient roots. Most of us spritz on a fragrance without considering the hundreds, even thousands, of years of history that went into perfecting this art. But the Egyptians knew that perfume was more than just a pleasant smell. It was a message to the gods, a way to communicate with the divine, and a reflection of one's place in society. When they created perfumes, they weren't just creating a commodity. They were crafting something sacred, something powerful, something that had the potential to alter the very atmosphere around them. Historians still argue about the finer details of how Egyptian perfume making evolved over time. Some scholars believe that perfume making techniques were refined with the rise of different pharaohs, each bringing new innovations and variations. Others suggest that certain techniques, such as enfleurage, were kept secret by the priesthood, passed down only to those with the knowledge to wield its power. However, one thing is certain: the Egyptians were masters of fragrance, and their influence on the art of perfumery continues to echo through the centuries. In modern perfumery, we see a lot of the same principles the Egyptians valued. Fragrance is still used as a tool of communication, a way to express identity, status, and emotion. The art of creating perfumes, of blending oils and extracts to create something harmonious, is a craft that has been refined and perfected over the centuries. but the roots of that art can be traced directly back to the Nile. Even today, many of the ingredients that were favored by the ancient Egyptians continue to be the cornerstone of modern perfumes. Myrrh, frankincense, rose, and jasmine, these timeless flowers and resins are still used in the most luxurious perfumes, drawing on the same symbolism and power that the Egyptians recognized centuries ago. The ancient practice of combining these elements into fragrant oils and perfumes is as relevant now as it was in the time of the pharaohs, connecting us to the past in a deeply sensory way. But the legacy of Egyptian perfume making isn't just about the physical ingredients or the techniques used. It's about the spiritual connection between fragrance and the divine. The Egyptians viewed scent not merely as a luxury, but as a bridge to the gods. They believed that the act of wearing perfume could bring them closer to the divine, and that fragrance had the power to influence not just their bodies, but their souls. In the modern world, we may not think of perfume as a spiritual tool, but we still recognize the profound effect it can have on our mood and emotions. The act of wearing a scent that we love can make us feel confident, calm, or empowered, and it has the ability to transport us to a different time or place, just as the Egyptians believed their perfumes could carry them closer to the gods. As we close our journey through the world of ancient Egyptian perfume making, think about the ways in which scent continues to shape your life today. From the perfumes you wear to the candles that scent your home, fragrance remains a powerful tool for self-expression, healing, and connection. And while the methods and ingredients may have evolved, the spiritual power of scent, the same power the Egyptians recognized thousands of years ago, is still very much alive. Now, as you drift into sleep, let the fragrance of this journey settle in. Remember the flowers, the oils, the sacred rituals, and the divine connection that perfume once embodied. Just as the ancient Egyptians used scent to connect with their gods, may you find your own moments of divine connection wherever your journey takes you.